Hello everybody. It is March 22nd, 2025 here in the United States of America. Now in this video, just as a heads up, I need to use the audio, the microphone that's actually on my webcam, my actual microphone right here next to me. I'm having an issue where it's not recording in stereo, it's recording in mono. And a couple other issues I need to look at, and I should have those resolved soon. So I apologize for the sound quality on this recording. It's not going to be the best, but it'll do. Anywho, I want to talk about the proposed ceasefire between Russia and Ukraine in regards to energy infrastructure and what I think about this ceasefire and if it is going to hold. Now, from what I understand, there was a verbal agreement initially with President Zelensky in regards to, President Putin. There was a proposal in regards to implementing some kind of step-by-step ceasefire. The first step was a ceasefire in regards to energy infrastructure. Russia would no longer target Ukraine's energy infrastructure, and the proposal was, well, in return, Ukraine will not target Russia's energy infrastructure. Do I think that's a realistic scenario, a realistic ceasefire that either side will abide by? In war, infrastructure is frequently targeted. That's actually one of the main targets, is infrastructure. Manufacturing, energy, transportation. One is to win a war, then these things are important to target. Factories run off of electricity. Factories that make armaments, and without electricity, those factories have to rely on generators, which consumes fuel, and the more fuel that those generators consume, the less fuel that's going to the front lines. And some of these factories, because they're older factories, might not have sufficient generators to actually run the equipment that they need to be powered. So it's a big step if any nation proposes to actually refrain from targeting energy infrastructure. Now, I would say that Russia stands to benefit much more from not targeting energy infrastructure than Ukraine does. Russia has decimated much of Ukraine's energy infrastructure already. Now, it has purposefully not targeted much of its energy infrastructure during the winter months, I think is a show of mercy, because Ukraine does get very, very, very cold, and without electricity to heat homes, the chances of people dying of hypothermia is quite high. I think I think Russia was probably trying to avoid too much suffering amongst the civilian population of Ukraine for several reasons. Probably to avoid a large outcry from its allies and countries around the world, probably trying to, at least for its own ends, show some kind of goodwill in regards to the Ukrainian people to mitigate their suffering. I mean, this war has had a fairly low rate of civilian casualties compared to wars of comparable scope and scale, and I think there's been a concerted effort to try to leave civilians out of this war as much as possible. Now, I'm not saying that is done entirely to be magnanimous. There are political considerations and reasons for civilians generally being, for the most part, left alone in this war, compared to the scale where they could be subject to airstrikes and direct consequences of this war. Now, that being said, Ukraine has routinely targeted Russian oil refineries within range of the Ukrainian border. Now, Ukraine is limited by how far they can actually strike inside of Russia, because their air force can't fly inside of Russia. Those planes would be shot down immediately due to Russia's air defense. So they can launch cruise missiles and artillery and drones, because those can either be a little too quick to intercept, they can fly under radar, drones for example. Some of these drones are actually launched inside of Russian soil, from clandestine operations inside of Russia. Now, although the amount of infrastructure actually struck hasn't exactly been crippling to Russia, it has become a nuisance. It has shown that Ukraine is still somewhat in this fight and can still target Russian infrastructure within range reasonably well. Although, like I said, Russia is a massive country. A few oil refineries close to the Ukrainian border aren't really. Excuse me one second. Sweetie, I'll be down soon. Okay, well, I'll be down soon. Honey, I promise I'll be down soon. Anyway, sorry. It hasn't really had much of an effect on the war. It's more of a nuisance to Russia than anything else. Russia has countless oil refineries that are out of range of Ukraine, and if they really wanted to move oil refineries, if they were desperate enough, or it was something urgent, they could move oil refineries further away from the Ukraine border if it was actually having a real impact on the Russian economy and the Russian war effort. That being said, the proposal to stop infrastructure strikes, although that does benefit Russia a bit more than Ukraine, I think is a real proposal, like a real step towards some kind of ceasefire, because I think it is in Russia's best interests to end this war sooner rather than later. Could they drag this war out for another few years and take everything up to the Dnieper? They could, absolutely could, but do they want to pay that price in lives? So do they want to spend the capital to do that? Do they want to occupy large portions of a country that might offer up some kind of resistance? Now, in the 4 regions that Russia has annexed, they aren't facing really any local resistance because most of those people are Russian-speaking and ethnically Russian and identify as so. But the further west Russia moves, the more and more people they encounter that identify themselves as Ukrainian first and foremost, that would offer some kind of resistance and make the occupation for Russia rather difficult, and they would have to station large amounts of troops in these regions. I don't think Russia wants to do that. Despite what Russian hardliners say, I don't think to Vladimir Putin it's a realistic proposal to occupy everything up to the Dnieper. Now, would that be an inevitability if this, say, all aid stopped to Ukraine and this war were to drag on for another 3 years? Yes, inevitably the Russians would make it to the Dnieper. But like I said, given the set of circumstances as they exist now, I think they would like to avoid that, and I'm sure as far as territory being annexed, the 4 regions they already do possess: Zaporizhia, Kherson, Donetsk, and what's the other one? Lugansk. I don't see any other territorial acquisitions happening after that, if some kind of peace agreement were to be reached. Many people say that Russia would want Odessa. I don't think Ukraine would allow themselves to become a landlocked country. I think the only way Russia is going to have Odessa is if they took it by force. And again, like I said, I don't think Russia currently is not willing. I mean, I'm sure the resolve is there if they have to do it, but they would prefer, again, to end this war without costing much more in the way of lives and money. Now, as for further negotiations, I've heard about a moratorium on targeting shipping in the Black Sea. That's something that's been proposed, and from what I understand, the deal on the table is that there will be successive ceasefires in different aspects of the war up until there's a full ceasefire for at least 30 days, and then during those 30 days, then a real peace would be negotiated. Now, Ukraine is in a very tough position as far as what they can negotiate on. Now, back in 2022, Ukraine was actually offered, from what I understand, an extremely generous deal by the Russians. Now I'm just kind of breezing over what was offered, but what was on the table was Russia would largely withdraw from all occupied Ukrainian territory. Donetsk and Lugansk would be made semi-autonomous parts of Ukraine. They wouldn't officially become parts of Russia, and that Russia would reimburse Ukraine for Crimea, but it would not be giving Crimea back ever. And in return, all Ukraine, I think there was some demilitarization on the table. I believe they had to scale back their military, get rid of the far right, neo-Nazi militias that were present within the Ukrainian military, and they had to declare neutrality. But in return, Ukraine would have kept most of their sovereignty. Now, initially, or it retained most of their territory, certainly more than they have now. Now, the deal was, I guess, more or less signed, and then at the last minute, Zelensky was, rumor has it, talked out of accepting it by a certain prime minister from a certain Western country. Now, if you look at this in a pragmatic way, anybody, say if you were a negotiator on Ukraine's side and you were looking at this, from a realistic perspective, like, okay, what's my country's population? Can we actually fight a long war against Russia? Can we win this war? What's our economic viability after this war is over? How many people are we losing? How many people are fleeing the country? Now you take all those factors together. Okay, what's the best option? Okay, obviously, take the peace deal. Yes, Ukraine would essentially be bending the knee to Russia, but would receive a fairly generous deal in return. Now, because there's very ardent Ukrainian nationalists within the government that absolutely refuse to bend to Russia in any way, shape, or form, I think that was one of a large influence, a large reason why this deal was rejected. I think Zelensky was also trying to keep them happy, because also keep in mind too, from what I understand, the lead negotiator was negotiator on the Ukrainian side was executed. Now, I think at this point in the war, this was the best deal Ukraine could have gotten. The second best deal Ukraine could have gotten was if it came to the negotiating table immediately following the offensive in Kherson, Kharkov. There was a large portion of territory that Russia very loosely held within Kharkov. The Ukrainian army was able to drive the Russians out, largely because the Russians didn't have enough men to occupy that territory and hold defensive lines. Because initially when Russia went into Ukraine, that wasn't its intention. It went in with a fairly small force and not enough to occupy the amount of territory that it had taken from the Ukrainians. Once the Ukrainians resolved themselves to fight on, the Russians were in a difficult situation. They had to make hard choices, and they couldn't hold much of the land that they already held, despite the fact they had previously withdrawn from the area around Kiev. They still had a fairly small number of men for the amount of territory they took. Ukraine took full advantage of this and drove the Russians out of Kharkov. Now, the Russians made the Ukrainians pay dearly for this. The Ukrainians did incur heavy losses, and Russia fell back to more defensible positions. Immediately after this, though, Ukraine, at this point, given Russia's lack of preparation for fighting a long war, at that moment was, you could say, winning the war. Now, that wasn't a victory that was going to last. Inevitably, the tide would turn against them due to Russia's, much larger population, much higher degree of weapons production, and a larger military, a larger pool of armed men, to call upon. Ukraine should have come to the negotiating table at that point, and again, probably would have gotten not as good of a deal that they were offered in 2022, but definitely a better deal than they'd be offered. Now, actually, General Mark Milley, as much as I think he was an incompetent fool, was being honest with the Ukrainians, and he told them, this is your time to come to the negotiating table and sit down with the Russians. Now that you have somewhat of an advantage on the battlefield, it's going to be short-lived. Once the Russians mobilize more men and steel themselves for a longer war, then the outcome is inevitable. The Ukrainians rejected this offer, from what I understand, and resolved themselves to fight on, because to the Ukrainian leadership, especially the Ukrainian nationalists, this war has always been an all or nothing. It's either victory or destruction. Now, when you're governing a nation in times of war, that is a suicidal and suicidally stupid attitude to hold. War is... Most wars end in negotiations. Most wars don't end in annihilation. Typically, I think one thing we're used to seeing in the West is World War II has kind of given us this notion of, if there's an aggressor, then they're fought to the bitter end until they're defeated and destroyed. No surrender, no quarter. Unconditional surrender is the inevitable outcome when fighting against tyranny. But a large part of that was the government of Germany in the 40s sort of left the Allies no choice. They had the same kind of mentality that the Japanese had, and I think some of the Ukrainian leadership has now. It's victory is inevitable if we just fight on long enough. Somehow the Russian economy and the Russian government will fall apart, and in that chaos, and we can reclaim Ukraine. A certain German leader had the same idea towards the end of World War II. Was that was the entire reason for the Battle of the Bulge. If he could just drive a wedge between the American and British armies and retake Antwerp and show that the German army still had some kind of fight in it, then the Allies would come to the negotiating table and they would exit the war. They would come to some kind of settlement with the Germans, and they would abandon the Soviet Union, and then Germany could face the Soviet Union with the remainder of its military, even though it wouldn't have mattered at that point anyways. But that was Hitler's plan, and that was a very, very, very unrealistic and almost politically impossible thing to achieve. The Allies were not going to stop fighting at that point unless the Germans came to the table and said, okay, we surrender. What do you want? They weren't going to abandon the Soviet Union, especially after all the money and equipment they've given the Soviet Union. They were in this war until the bitter end, despite what the German leadership believed. And I also think too that there was part of the German government that thought, okay, well, if we just fight on long enough, the Soviet hordes will just lose enough men and they'll just kind of fall apart and go home. But again, none of that's even remotely politically realistic. And I think some of the Ukrainian leadership has kind of taken that same position. If we just hold out long enough, this Russian house of cards will collapse and we'll get our whole country back. But in reality, like I said, I think if this war drags on, especially without Western support, the Ukrainians are going to lose everything up to the Dnieper. So they're in a bit of a difficult situation now. They don't really have any leverage. They're clearly losing the war. They've rejected an extremely generous peace proposal compared to what they would get now. Ultimately, they're not going to get these 4 regions back in their entirety. Russia will, by bare minimum, hold on to the territory that it currently possesses. If a ceasefire happens, then perhaps if Ukraine doesn't want to hand over the rest of Zaporizhia and the Donbass to or Donetsk to Russia, perhaps there'll be some kind of deal where there'll be a referendum in the remainder of those territories, and then after that, if they vote for it, they can join Russia. Well, I don't know how that would work out either. I think at this point the Ukrainian leadership doesn't really have any other option other to accept the fact that they gambled in 2022. They gambled on Western support. They gambled on the idea that the Russian economy would fall apart due to the sanctions, and they lost. They lost that gamble. And this is the end result of it. They bet the house on a glorious victory, and they lost. So the ultimate consequence for them is they're going to lose these 4 regions. There's really no other way around it. And I think maybe the idea of accepting a step-by-step ceasefire is the first acknowledgments from the Ukrainian side that they might be coming to the same conclusion finally, that more reasonable figures within the Ukrainian government are starting to have a bit more influence. Because at this point it's either, again, like I said, Ukraine comes to the negotiating table or it loses more territory over time. I mean, it's just, even Trump's chief negotiator has said, more or less said so on with Tucker Carlson. I think most, and again, like most realistic political figures that speak on the subject, most diplomats with any kind of reasonable head on their shoulders are coming to the same conclusion. People might not like it. There's plenty of people that support the Ukrainian side. The Ukrainian army has fought valiantly. They absolutely have. There's no denying that. There's plenty of people that are in principle against the idea of aggression against your neighbors. Well, that's all well and good, but reality is reality, and I don't think the Ukrainians can get around that at this point. I don't think anybody can. That's just the way that things are. And the world isn't willing to descend. Nations around the world, especially the influential ones, aren't willing to descend into the absolute hell of World War III over 4 regions in eastern Ukraine. They're just not. Nobody's willing to do that. Despite what Europe says, it's all posturing. They're not actually willing to do so. Nobody is. Again, like, all these positions are predicated on this idea that Russia is magically going to fall apart any day now economically. Putin's going to be overthrown, and the Russian army will withdraw because of its own internal turmoil. Again, even if Vladimir Putin were to die tomorrow, the Russian government is strong enough and stable enough where it'll survive his passing. I mean, I think it would be foolish to assume that he hasn't prepared contingencies for this. He is in his 70s. He is becoming an old man. He knows eventually he will die. I'm sure there's been conversations in the Russian government about what will happen then. There's preparations made. These people aren't stupid. So again, it's a pipe dream. So do I think a ceasefire on energy infrastructure will hold? If the Ukrainians want an end to this war, I think it will. Russia has an interest in ending this war sooner rather than later, not out of desperation, but just out of pragmatism and practicality. I think if the Ukraine side holds up to their end, I would see the Russians holding up to their end as well. They know they hold every advantage in this war. They know they hold most of the negotiating cards, and they know that they're probably going to get most of what they want out of a negotiation at this point. They're definitely, again, according to Trump's chief negotiator, from what he says, the Ukrainian government has largely given up on the idea of joining NATO, and that was one of the main causes of this war. And they would also have to come to terms with the fact that those 4 regions aren't coming back anytime soon. But like I said, as for the energy infrastructure ceasefire, time will tell. We'll see if that holds, and then a maritime ceasefire holds, and then there can be some kind of ceasefire across the line of contact, and that holds. Then I would say at that point we are nearing the end stages of this war. But as with the ceasefire in Gaza, many people said, well, this was the end of the war too. Well, that ceasefire appears to have fallen apart through no fault, I would say, of Donald Trump's. But again, Hamas and Israel are 2 very difficult parties to bring to the table, to have them agree on anything. But anyways, I will be doing another video this Wednesday. If you enjoyed this content, please give me a like, subscribe, share this video, and until next time.